Joe McCaffrey, and I'm a visiting fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Science in fall 2025. I'm visiting from the University of Nebraska, Omaha. I'm a philosopher of neuroscience and psychology who's interested in the human mind and the scientific study of it. And one thing that philosophers of science do is analyze big changes or revolutions in scientific thinking or scientific theorizing. The area of science that I'm interested in is called cognitive neuroscience, and this is a branch of science that explores how the brain constructs or relates to our cognitive processes, such as thinking or memory or learning. The scientific idea I'm interested in is called functional localization or human brain mapping. And that's what my project is really about. So to explain, all of us who learn brain science or learn a little bit about it, learn that different parts of the brain do different things. If you were to stimulate my right motor cortex, you might get movements out of my left hand. Famously, Phineas Gage, the railway worker who accidentally had a railway spike go through his frontal lobe, became really impulsive after his injury, suggesting, which has been confirmed in some sense, that impulse control resides in the frontal cortex. So this idea that you have distinct cognitive functions like attention or memory that localize to distinct parts of the brain is a very old one. In the 1800s, Franz Gall, the father of what's called phrenology, correlated people's intellectual and personality traits with the bumps on their skull, famously. You've probably all seen phrenological casts. And Paul Broca, the neurosurgeon, for example, identified a patient who had damage to his left frontal lobe, and this affected the control of his speech. So this patient, who was called Tan, because all he could say was Tan over and over again, could nonetheless understand what you were saying, right? And this suggests a specific association between so-called Broca's area and the control of our speech. So this scientific paradigm or worldview, functional localization, has really been one of the central projects in cognitive neuroscience from the 1800s all the way through with the invention of cognitive neuroimaging techniques like positron emission tomography or functional magnetic resonance imaging, which allows us to look at what's going on in the human brain when people are in a scanner performing memory tasks, for example. So what I'm really interested in as a philosopher is the dispute between those who believe functional localization is an important guiding paradigm for cognitive neuroscience and so-called anti-localizationists who think that this paradigm, we should actually abandon it, that the brain doesn't actually work this way. Even going back to the 1800s with figures like Gall and Broca, there were also figures like Florenz and others who denied that functions localized to the brain. Instead, their picture to different regions of the brain. Instead, their picture was really that the whole brain contributes in some complex way to different cognitive functions, or that parts of the brain aren't really specialized, that they're interactive, that they work together. These ideas, which were sort of eclipsed as brain imaging and what we call cognitive neuroscience took off, are now interestingly back in fashion in some corners of cognitive neuroscience. So there are many philosophers and neuroscientists who've noted that the relationship between brain regions or brain networks or brain structures on one hand and cognitive functions like attention or memory on the other is much more complicated than the localization picture seems to suggest. So it's just one example. Broca's area, which I said was a speech production area, is actually involved in a host of other functions, it seems, including, for those who have musical expertise, recognizing what's going on in music, or even what allows us to imitate people's motor movements, as would occur in a dance. And while Broca's is one example, this seems to be a general feature of the brain that the structures we identify seem to have many different functions at some level of description. Another complicating factor is that there seem to be some cases where different parts of the brain can perform the same function. So you might characterize a function like working memory and notice that maybe the brain structures that are involved in it are actually different in different experiments. Or we might even note that the brain areas relating to cognition are changing across the lifespan, as some have suggested. And the general picture here is that we actually might need to abandon this scientific paradigm of functional localization, and really view cognition as arising from a set of contextually varying and interacting parts in some complex way. So As a philosopher of science, one thing I find really interesting is that the scientists in this world, there's scientists in neuroimaging journals who believe functional localization is really the central paradigm for neuroscience. There's other neuroscientists who believe we should abandon it and perform our analyses differently. They can't all agree on an experiment, which would kind of settle this ongoing debate. It's really mired in, I would say, the way the scientists are interpreting the data that they're getting. Therefore, I think there's a role for a philosopher to really analyze what is this debate about, and in some to examine carefully the historical roots and the fate of this scientific paradigm.